local rescue team once described a detail from a cave search that never quite made sense to anyone involved. Something small that did not seem frightening at first, but slowly became the most disturbing part of the entire incident. At the mouth of a narrow limestone cave system that a diver had explored dozens of times before, his tanks, fins, mask, and lights were found resting on the ground, as if they had been arranged carefully by someone who planned to come back and collect them later. Nothing was scattered, nothing looked damaged, and the cave entrance showed no sign of a struggle or accident. Yet the diver himself was completely gone, and what investigators later discovered about the cave's history made that neat little stack of equipment feel less like preparation and more like a message left behind for whoever came looking. Before we start, please subscribe if you haven't already. The man who disappeared was named Daniel Mercer, and people in the small town near the ridge knew him mostly as the quiet diver who spent nearly every weekend exploring the flooded cave systems that ran under the forested hills outside town. Daniel was in his late 30s, careful with his gear, patient underwater, and known among other divers as someone who never rushed through a cave, because he understood how quickly things could go wrong in narrow passages filled with silt and darkness. Over the years, he had mapped several sections of the limestone tunnels that twisted through the rock beneath the valley, and although the system was complicated, it was familiar territory to him, the kind of place where he could move through tight underwater corridors by memory alone, following the guidelines he had placed there on earlier dives. The cave he planned to explore that morning was called Halbrook Sink, a low opening in a rocky depression about half a mile into the forest, where rainwater drained underground into a flooded tunnel that stretched for miles beneath the hills. Daniel had entered that cave many times before, and he knew the route well enough that he sometimes joked with other divers that he could swim it in complete darkness if all his lights failed. It was not an easy cave by any means, but it was predictable, and that predictability was part of what made it appealing to him. That morning he arrived just after sunrise, parking his truck near the narrow trail that led through the trees toward the limestone sinkhole. The air was still cool from the night, and the forest was quiet except for the slow movement of wind through the leaves, the kind of calm morning that made the place feel peaceful rather than dangerous. Daniel carried his equipment down the path in 2 trips, setting his tanks and gear beside the shallow pool that marked the cave entrance, and according to the timestamps later recovered from the small camera mounted to his helmet, he spent nearly 20 minutes checking each piece of equipment, tightening straps, adjusting valves, and testing his lights. Nothing in that footage suggested that he felt uneasy or rushed, and when he finally lowered himself into the dark water and began swimming toward the narrow stone opening beneath the surface, his movements were slow and confident, the routine of someone who had done the same thing many times before. The early part of the dive looked exactly like his previous explorations of Halbrook Sink. The camera showed the familiar limestone tunnel sloping downward, its walls smooth in some places and jagged in others where the rock had broken away long ago. The water was clear that day, and the beam of his light reached several feet ahead of him as he followed the thin guideline that led deeper into the system. Small pale fish drifted away from the light as he passed, and clouds of fine silt stirred gently behind his fins. About 15 minutes into the dive, he reached a section where the tunnel widened slightly, forming a chamber where the ceiling rose high above the water and pockets of trapped air collected against the rock. Daniel had stopped there before during earlier dives, sometimes surfacing briefly in the air pocket to rest and adjust his equipment before continuing deeper into the cave. The camera footage showed him doing exactly that, swimming upward until his head broke the surface inside the dark chamber, where the only sound was the quiet dripping of water from the stone ceiling. For several minutes he floated there calmly, checking the pressure gauge on his tank and adjusting one of the lights mounted on his helmet. Then something small changed in the footage. It was not dramatic or obvious at first, but Daniel suddenly turned his head toward the far side of the chamber, where the rock wall curved downward into darkness again. And although the camera could not capture whatever he thought he heard, his body language shifted in a way that suggested he was listening carefully to something inside the cave. At first he remained still, floating quietly in the water as if waiting for the sound to repeat. And for a moment it almost looked as though he had imagined it, because he eventually shook his head slightly and prepared to continue the dive. Then the sound came again. The microphone on his helmet picked up a faint echo from somewhere deeper in the cave, a low movement in the water that did not sound like falling droplets or shifting rocks, and Daniel slowly turned his light toward the narrow passage that led away from the chamber. The beam of light traveled along the tunnel wall, revealing nothing unusual except smooth limestone and suspended particles of silt drifting through the water. Still, he remained there longer than usual, watching the dark opening in silence before finally taking a breath and submerging again to continue the dive. The rest of the camera footage was never recovered. Daniel's disappearance was first noticed late that afternoon when he failed to return home, and after several hours his brother drove out to Halbrook Sink, following the familiar trail through the forest until he reached the shallow pool at the cave entrance. That was where the strange detail appeared. Daniel's equipment was sitting neatly on the rock beside the water. Both of his tanks were upright, his fins were placed side by side, and his mask and lights rested carefully on top of the gear, as if someone had taken the time to remove everything one piece at a time and arrange it in an orderly stack. The only thing missing was Daniel himself. Rescue divers arrived that evening and entered the cave system with powerful lights and additional guidelines, searching every passage Daniel had mapped during his earlier dives. They moved slowly through the flooded tunnels, checking air pockets, side passages, and narrow crevices where a trapped diver might be hiding or injured. They found nothing. No damaged equipment, no tangled guideline, no sign that anyone had panicked or struggled underwater. After 2 days of searching, they began expanding the search deeper into parts of the cave Daniel had never explored before. Passages so narrow that divers could only move through them by removing their tanks and pushing them ahead in the darkness. Even there, they found nothing that suggested Daniel had gone farther into the system. The cave seemed empty. During the investigation, one of the older residents of the nearby town mentioned something that had not been widely known among the divers who visited Halbrook Sink. Decades earlier, long before the cave became popular among explorers, a small group of local teenagers had used the sinkhole as a secret swimming spot during the summer. And according to old newspaper records, one of those teenagers had disappeared inside the cave after swimming into one of the submerged tunnels. The boy's body had never been recovered. At the time, people assumed he had become trapped in the cave and drowned somewhere beyond the reach of the early rescue attempts. And eventually, the story faded into a quiet local memory that most visitors never heard about. But a detail from that old incident stood out when investigators looked back at it carefully. When the boy disappeared, his clothes had been found folded neatly on the rocks beside the water, just like Daniel's equipment. That similarity alone might have been dismissed as coincidence if it were not for something one of the rescue divers later reported during the search. While exploring the same air pocket chamber where Daniel had surfaced earlier in the dive, the diver said he had heard a faint movement in the water somewhere beyond the narrow passage leading deeper into the cave. At first he assumed it was another diver adjusting equipment farther down the line, but when he called out through the water using his voice amplifier, there was no response. Only the same slow sound again, like something moving carefully through the tunnel. When he shined his light down the passage, he did not see a diver. Instead, he saw the thin guideline Daniel had installed during previous explorations, drifting slightly in the water, as if something had brushed against it moments earlier. The line extended deeper into darkness, where the tunnel narrowed beyond the range of the light. The diver followed the line for several meters, before reaching a point where the passage became too tight for a person to pass through without removing their tanks. And although he carefully checked every surface of the rock, there was no sign that anyone had recently forced their way into the narrow opening. The guideline simply continued into darkness. Investigators eventually developed a theory that seemed to explain the strange details surrounding Daniel's disappearance. They believed that during his dive, Daniel had heard the same mysterious movement in the cave that the rescue diver later described, and curiosity may have drawn him deeper into an unmapped section of the tunnel where he encountered something unexpected, possibly the remains of the boy who disappeared decades earlier. What they suspected Daniel discovered was an air-filled chamber hidden deeper inside the cave, a place where the missing boy might have survived for a short time before eventually dying alone in the darkness. But there was another possibility that quietly circulated among the divers who knew the cave well. They understood that underwater caves behave strangely when small openings connect different chambers, allowing pressure changes and water movement to carry sounds from far away through narrow tunnels. Sometimes those sounds could travel for miles. If someone or something had been moving through the deeper parts of the cave system, Daniel might have heard it clearly even though it was far beyond the passages he knew. And if he had followed that sound far enough, into sections of the cave no diver had ever explored, he might have found something waiting in the darkness that had been there much longer than anyone realized. Because the final unsettling detail about Halbrook's sink did not come from the search teams or the investigation records. It came from the old map Daniel had been working on for years. In the corner of the last updated version, drawn lightly in pencil near the deepest tunnel he had reached, there was a small note he had written to himself during a dive a few months earlier. It simply said that sometimes, when floating quietly in the air pocket chamber, faint breathing sounds could be heard echoing through the cave from somewhere deeper in the rock. And beside that note, he had written a second line in smaller letters. Someone else down there,